Uh, Good afternoon, everybody. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's meeting on policy framework to scale up negative emissions or carbon removals. You know, since some time, there is a large acknowledgement that we will need carbon removals. The technologies exist, or we hope, or we are sure they will exist very soon. In many cases, they are structured according to nature-based and technology-based. But what is really missing so far are the policy frameworks that are gradually, now that these technologies are developed, are also built up. This is where our SEPS work comes in. We have a large portfolio of different projects, some on negative emissions, BECCS, some on biomass, carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture and utilization, which all broadly can be related to removals. And for us at SEPS, the question is, how does it fit all together? Today, we will discuss this question in 1.5 hours with our speakers. Sabine Fuß from the Mercator Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change at the Humboldt University, and she has many other titles, and she is very well versed in this topic, so we're very pleased you could make it. She will discuss the critical issues of nature and technology-based solutions. At least that's what we have given as title, but I'm sure Sabine will speak, fine-tune and speak about the points that she thinks most important. The other speaker is Linde Zuidema, who is a research associate at the School for Transnational Governance at the European University in Florence, and also in the trinomics. She works also in trinomics in the Netherlands. And then we have comments by Fabien Ramos in DG Klima, who seems to be, Fabien, I think I'm correct, seems to be sort of the person really on negative emissions these days. So the persons you turn to if you want to know something about negative emissions, or if you want to know everything about negative emissions. So that's the person to call, and he should be commenting on what the other says, and then to kick off the discussion. In addition, we also have a number of very short presentations on negative emissions technologies, DAC, and enhanced weathering, for example. And we have asked speakers to stay within 5 minutes, those presenting the technologies, not those who presenting the technologies, to just give a snapshot in 5 minutes about what kind of volumes they would expect on negative emissions in 2050 or possibly before. On the monitoring and certification possibility there, we would like to hear a little bit, how certain these things are. Storage with a view on permanence, and then also a little bit on this demand side, what incentives are needed. Now, I know to do this in 5 minutes is a challenge, but this should just be sort of helping us to introduce the debate. But we're starting with my colleagues from SEPS, who will present sort of a draft outline of a background paper they are preparing on negative emissions, definitions, technologies, and policy issues, which is the kickoff of our work there. And we hope to publish before the summer a paper where we take stock of where we are, what are the policy issues, how can you introduce these negative emissions into the policy framework. And I know, of course, Fabien and his colleagues are, at least those who have time before the 14th of July, are working very heavily on this. Maybe then just Milan, if you wish to start the presentation, I guess you will be sharing some slides with us. Milan.
Yes, indeed. Thank you very much, Christian. So my name is Milan Alkobot, a research fellow here at SEPS, and I'm working together with Christian and my other colleague, Julie, on this project. And as a first step, we are starting with a scoping paper. It's perhaps rather modest in its scope, in its ambition. We just like to clarify a little bit what the different concepts and terms are that are really important for this debate, and then also end up with what the important policy questions are. It's a bit too early to answer them yet, but we at least want to see what a successful negative emissions policy would have to take into account. So first, the very basic questions, why talk about negative emissions? So in general, this is because it will be pretty much inevitable somehow to have at least a few residual emissions in other sectors of the economy, whether in industry or in agriculture, perhaps elsewhere as well. How much this will be is really, in the end, a political choice. But the fact that there will at least be a little volume of those residual emissions is hardly controversial. Then longer term, there's also the need to deliver net negative emissions. So that will be to go beyond climate neutrality, beyond net zero greenhouse gas emissions, as the EU is planning by mid-century, because it might be the case that overall emissions globally are still too high, or that there is a temperature overshoot. And for that reason, we still need to do more removals of carbon dioxide to get to a level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere where we think the climate impacts are manageable. So what does the IPCC say about this? I think Sabine will, of course, talk about this in much more detail, but very generally, there's a headline number of 100 to 1,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal throughout the 21st century. So this is not per year, it's the aggregate of the 21st century. But if you consider that right now emissions are about 40 gigatons, it is still a very considerable volume. Then annually, this might, it will really depend on the scenario, but it might range from just a few gigatons, maybe not even more than 1 or 2, to well over 20 gigatons a year. So almost equal to half of the CO2 emissions that are there at the moment. And then in most scenarios of the IPCC, these net negative emissions, where we go beyond zero and draw down the concentration in the atmosphere, are also needed again. It's not all of them, but definitely the large majority of them. And then, as the decades progress, we will also learn more about the actual temperature increase. And the more there is a temperature overshoot, the more negative emissions we will also need, probably including in the EU. So how does the EU talk about it? There still is the fantastic document of the long-term strategy with a number of scenarios. 2 of these scenarios are really targeted at the 1.5 degrees target of the Paris Agreement. There is a more technology-heavy scenario and a more life, sort of natural-based solutions-heavy scenario. Both of them have a lot of removals, but of course the emphasis is more on technological removal in the one case, around 600 megatons, versus natural sinks, so mostly expanded forests in the other scenario. Then the other main question is, why do we want to discuss negative emissions today, if this is something that might only really become more important in the second half of the century? The first reason for that is that the technologies to remove carbon from the atmosphere, just as with any other technology to just reduce emissions, they also have their learning curves. They might still need cost reductions. And one way to achieve that is by having deployment and increasing scale. So we need incentives for that early, so that at a moment when we need a whole lot more of them, it is also competitive to deploy them at scale. And a very other important reason is that we are not starting from a blank slate. There are already existing EU policy frameworks which incorporate some negative emissions technologies, especially with the more natural sinks and the role of forests. So then there are a few key concepts which in the paper we would like to clarify, because occasionally, especially in more policy debates, you see different interpretations of them. The first, of course, is negative emissions and carbon dioxide removal itself. The two are not exactly the same, but we can use them roughly interchangeably. Although the key thing is that it is about the removal of CO2 from the atmosphere, and there are a lot of other greenhouse gases as well, methane, nitrous oxide, etc. In theory, it's possible to remove other greenhouse gases as well, but the focus is really on the removal of CO2, because that is the greenhouse gas that stays in the atmosphere the longest. Net negative emissions, I already explained. It's really about going below net zero greenhouse gases, as we have in the EU now agreed to reach by 2050. And then there are different technologies in which to do it. What we use in the paper and also in this debate is that any possible ways in which you can achieve this is considered a technology, just to make the phrasing a little bit easier. But that also means that something like afforestation is for this debate considered a technology. Then finally, mitigation and carbon sinks. We are following sort of the glossary of the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees, and their negative emissions, or more precisely carbon dioxide removal, is considered one form of climate change mitigation, because it really addresses the core issue of the concentration in the atmosphere. But there still might be good reasons to see it separately from emissions reductions, which is the common way to look at climate change mitigation. And then finally, carbon sinks are any process, activity, or mechanisms which removes a greenhouse gas from the atmosphere, according to the UNFCCC. Maybe the most important thing to keep in mind here is that a sink, for that reason, does not per se have to be natural. It can also be technological. So how do we categorize these different technologies? The most common way is with nature versus technology based. This is also what is implicitly already happening in the EU debate. It seems to make sense at first, but when you look into the different technologies, you also see that there are some hybrids, for example, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, which is a bit of both. There are also other ways in which you could potentially look at this. One is by focusing really on the process of removal, which is something the IPCC talks about. So natural processes versus chemical processes. You could perhaps also look at the storage type, whether it's really in geological formations, whether it's the greenhouse gas itself, or whether it turns into sort of more solid carbon over time. But what we think is particularly promising is by distinguishing on the basis of permanence. And high permanence means that the removal is not easily reversed. This is, of course, very attractive from a carbon accounting perspective. But we should also highlight that the fact that you do not have permanence, as you might have with afforestation and reforestation, does not necessarily imply that you have to disqualify or disregard the options. There are still very good reasons to consider both. Just a quick overview of the different technologies that are out there. So we focus on the list of technologies that are also described by the IPCC. And this is a great overview from a paper who uses, I think, a slightly different graph also used by the IPCC, but then adds some additional info on things like permanence, the readiness of the technology, and also the potentials. So afforestation is pretty straightforward. It's planting more trees. Bioenergy with carbon capture and storage is the combustion of biomass, but then making sure that the carbon does not enter the atmosphere by using CCS technologies in the same way as you can also use CCS for regular emissions reduction. Biochar and soil carbon sequestration are approaches that more try to increase the carbon uptake in soils. And then there's also the idea of enhanced weathering and ocean fertilization, which has to do with grinding rocks and distributing in either land or sea, so that the carbon uptake there will be improved. And then finally, there is a more experimental technology where you would actually just capture the CO2 directly from the air. This requires a lot of electricity and heat, but if you can do it, then it's sort of a very direct way to achieve this.
Milan, you will need to speed up. You have used about 10 minutes already. Yeah.
Yes. So then the final thing to keep in mind are the policy considerations. The first thing we want to consider a little bit in the paper is the different time horizons. So for emissions reductions, we talk about mid-century. For negative emissions, it will need to be a bit later. But even more importantly, you might have different impacts on the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, depending on whether you look 1, 5, or 50 years ahead, depending on the technology. This is very important to keep in mind. Also, the idea of moral hazard, that is perhaps a little bit of a normative term, but it is the risk that if we rely a lot on large volumes of negative emissions, there is the risk that we displace regular emissions reductions. And if the negative emissions then don't deliver at the requisite scale, there is a real problem. Perhaps most importantly to keep in mind for the policy are the trade-offs. There are different ones for land use with agriculture, food security, biodiversity, but also in some cases the diversion of other low carbon resources like renewables, etc., which might be used to operate things like direct air capture. And then the question is, do we use them for regular emissions reductions or for the negative emissions? And then very last point is that ultimately the incentives and the business case will really matter. So we need to consider both the demand and the supply. And hopefully these are some of the things we can talk a little bit more about. So with that, I'll hand back over to you, Christian.
Thank you. Thank you, Milan, for setting us up. As Milan mentioned, we are working on this background paper, on this scoping paper, where we, will go much deeper into this. And some of you may be interested to have a look at it. We are very happy to share this with you later on. Now, let's go to Sabine. IPCC was mentioned all over the place, quite logically. Sabine is very much IPCC, but also permanence was an important point. So Sabine, you have prepared a presentation, but you may as well want to pick up any point that has been, reinforced, that has been made before. So please, Sabine, over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for this invitation to this really interesting event, and also to Milan for setting the scene so nicely. I was asked to highlight a couple of critical issues that we might want to pick up in the discussion. So let me immediately start into it. So actually, I don't really have to cover the IPCC pathways because we've seen them in Milan's presentation, but let me just pick out two exemplary ones to illustrate the point that we can use CDR, carbon dioxide removal, for different things. In scenario one, we're basically reducing emissions very drastically in the short term, and we're mainly using carbon dioxide removal to offset the remaining residual emissions. Whereas in scenario two, we drop less dramatically off the cliff. We still face quite a challenge in terms of emissions reductions, but it looks a little bit more smoothly. And we mainly use carbon dioxide removal then to also come back from an overshoot. Now, what we're currently seeing in discussions, especially in European countries and at EU level, is going more towards the first scenario, where we're thinking about how to sort of offset our residual emissions. We're not really talking about overshooting, but it's probably good to keep in the back of our minds what's behind that wide range of pathways that we've seen in Milan's presentation. And that's also why there is such a wide range of CDR requirements, talking about the 1.5 degree report. So Milan has also very nicely already defined what is carbon dioxide removal, or also called negative emissions. I've taken a taxonomy here from the emissions gap report in 2017, because that's something that's continuously used in the discussion, and that I feel might not be entirely helpful because of two reasons. So you see the natural options that also Milan explained in detail, and the technological ones. And my feeling is that just because natural usually comes also with a positive connotation, it's not always been very helpful in discussions to pin that against the technological ones, where we then also observe more public resistance. Second reason is also that some of the options that we're discussing don't really fit into one or the other category, and sort of sit a little bit awkwardly in between the two, and then are called hybrid options or combined options. And that's why I think if we're really thinking about policy frameworks and incentives, and how do we target those, it might be helpful to actually have a more, have a framework that orients itself more towards where the CO2 eventually ends up. Does part of it go back to the atmosphere? Does it get stored in the lithosphere, the hydrosphere, or the biosphere? And that then also enables us to discuss some of the options that haven't been discussed in so much depth yet, but that I actually want to put on a table. And this is a whole discussion around utilizing CO2, which is an attractive narrative, right? We don't consider the CO2 any longer as a waste, or as something that we have to sort of get rid of, but it becomes part of sort of a circular economy. We're using it again, we're storing the CO2 in products. We might have learning impacts for other CCS technologies. We actually use a cheaper or cleaner feedstock than conventional hydrocarbons. So it's not difficult to picture why this is an attractive narrative, but just a word of caution here. If you think back about the picture I've just shown you, not all processes that utilize CO2 necessarily contribute to addressing climate change, because CO2 utilization could actually increase CO2 emissions. Just think about if you use the CO2 and you use a lot of non-decarbonized energy to transform the CO2 into a product, and then you use the product and release the CO2 again, such as, for instance, in the case of a synthetic fuel, then you haven't really achieved a negative balance on a net basis. Or you could have no net impact on CO2, but increase other greenhouse gas emissions, potentially with synthetic fertilizers. Or you reduce CO2 emissions without removing CO2 from the atmosphere, specifically if you use fossil CO2. Or you could actually remove CO2 from the atmosphere on a net basis. And that's typically what we see in a systematic review that we did together with colleagues from Oxford in processes that involve BACs, for instance, also in industry. So just as a word of caution on how we sort of have to think about where the CO2 ends up in terms of thinking about the right policy framework, liability, incentives, and so on. Now, let's get back to the pathways. And Milan has already mentioned that the Commission came up with a range of scenarios, and two of them he already mentioned. One focused more on technologies to remove CO2, and one that focuses more on the natural or LULUCF type of pathways to remove CO2. And it's actually good that we have that range, because there has been quite some controversy around removing CO2, and specifically Milan already pointed to that had to do with the large prominence of of bioenergy combined with CCS in the global pathways he showed in the beginning. Not only because of perceived risks around geological storage, but very much also because of the large land areas that will be needed to cultivate the additional biomass that will be needed for that. And so it's good that we have a range of scenarios to sort of inform the underlying deliberation, the societal debate, and also the policy process. But what I also think is that it sort of tells us that we need to maybe step now a little bit backward from the global pathways and really actively think of what makes sense in a certain geographic context. And to illustrate that point, I've brought you a little case study from Sweden. You have a map here on the right-hand side. You actually see all the industrial point sources that are large. They're conveniently located at the coastline, so you could easily transport the CO2, say, to Northern Lights or other storage in the absence of in situ storage currently there. And the nice part about it is that a lot of those point sources, they are already biogenic. So retrofitting them with CCS means that you don't need to free up additional land to cultivate additional biomass. Still, if you plot that out as a marginal abatement cost curve, and the green ones are the biogenic sources, it shows you that that you could store quite a bit of biogenic CO2 and thereby achieve a negative balance. And if you add that up, it corresponds actually to more than half of the total emissions from all Swedish sectors. So that's just to show that sometimes we also need to see what makes sense, taking into account, of course, also all the negative potential environmental side effects, but to see what really comes out when you specifically look at a geographic context. So the second last critical issue I want to put on the table for the discussion is innovation. If I borrowed this graphic here from a friend of mine, Greg Nemeth, who looked into analogies with the development of solar PV and what that would imply for direct air capture. Now, solar PV, had the first commercial installation in '57, talking about low cost around 2017, but still being a little bit off from widespread adoption. If you would translate that one-to-one to direct air capture, we immediately see that there's a large innovation gap. We would need to accelerate development quite a bit in order to shift low cost from 2077, don't take those numbers too literally here, to the first half of the century in order to achieve widespread adoption earlier in the second half of the century. So this really is just supposed to be food for discussion here, but it also brings me to my last point, because likewise as Milan, because this is a policy session, I want to lose a couple of words here on incentivizing CDR, carbon dioxide removal. And so being an economist, in principle, if you don't have any feedbacks, there should be equal pricing for emissions and carbon dioxide removal. However, we also have to acknowledge that there, in the beginning, there might be market failures, external effects, technology-specific distortions, and that might actually ask for some price differentiation. I already touched on the need for innovation acceleration. So in the beginning, we'll probably also have to think about technology-specific support for R&D, pilots, and so on. Still also having long-term announced minimum CO2 prices for CDR as an incentive for innovation. And then probably accompany that with a regular review process, because this is a really dynamic field. I was talking about CCU, for instance. New ideas are emerging time and again, and we need to sort of decide what is actually what actually qualifies for support. Monitoring of removals and verification of permanently stored carbon is key in order to be able to verify the climate impact and therefore also direct incentives. And Milan has mentioned how permanence is especially an issue with natural climate solutions, and the monitoring challenge is of course bigger there than for point sources. So if it comes to instruments, I think there are two ways that we maybe should consider in a staged approach. individual measures that relate to individual CDR technologies and practices initially, but already having price-based approaches in mind. And also, once you transit to that and you overcome the monitoring challenges, it's of course important to keep the environmental side effects in mind, to supplement that with additional regulations for specific technological, ecological, and economic aspects. Final word on, because Milan mentioned moral hazard, so there could be unwanted interaction between climate change mitigation and removals. There are a couple of ideas out there how to go around that. I think the most prominent one that's also applying at EU considerations is to separate the targets for removals and emissions reductions. Sweden is thinking about having a reverse auctioning systems and so on. I think I have reached my limit, and I'll put that up for discussion later on when we discuss the instruments. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you, Sabine, for sticking to the limit. It's always a pleasure for the moderator, but also for your contributions. There were a few questions in the chat. You saw that. I just mentioned them to you, and if as we go on in the discussion, you may want to address them. I don't think we are yet at that issue. This is Brussels policy debate, so you would of course immediately jump to the ETS, and one of the questions was what mechanisms are developed for negative emissions trading. Then the reverse auctions were mentioned, the reverse auctions from Sweden, from Matthias Fridal. Probably, Sabine, you know him from, I guess, Linköping University or whatever it is. And then there was also another question relating to that, is the minimum carbon price for removals. What would you need? Now let's keep them in mind as the speakers go. They may want to address them, but there is one live questions, one raised hand from Jenny Lieu. And Jenny, if this is the correct name, my colleague Isabel will give you now the speaker's right, so you can briefly speak up. But please be as precise as you can, so that we can move on afterwards to the next speakers. Jenny, are you ready to speak up?
The hand is not raised anymore.
Oh, the hand is not raised anymore. Maybe it was a mistake. Okay. Then question answered. Moving on, moving on to Linde. We also thought there would be, oh no, it was my hand. We would enter somehow in the biomass BECS nature-based discussion. So I'm very pleased that my colleague Linde from European University Institute will ping a few points there. But Sabine, I have one more question. You say natural in Europe, and Linde always uses nature-based. Is there a difference between natural and nature-based, or is it just a different way of expressing it?
Yeah, so nature-based solutions are a little bit broader than nature-based solutions that address climate change, or that are used for climate change mitigation or even removals. And so sometimes you talk about a subset that's called then natural climate solutions, to acknowledge that nature-based solutions, they also apply to things like adaptation and other resource management strategies. So nature-based solutions is really a wide term that's most commonly used, yes. But I often use natural climate solutions to sort of acknowledge that this is sort of like a sub-part of these, but they're used interchangeably as well. So
yeah, okay, Sabine, I always understand this is very complicated. It seems to get even more complicated. So Linde, I fear after your presentation, I will be more confused, but, please, give us a bit of a take, what you see from what you have heard from Milan, from Sabine, but also in more general, what's the issues around the nature-based in a more narrow or wider sense, whatever definition you want to use. Please, Linde.
Sure. Thank you so much. And hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. So yeah, happy to reflect also on some of the things that the previous speakers have said, including the scope for price-based mechanisms and the need to consider side effects and co-benefits as well. All points that were mentioned were helpful to set the stage for a discussion, I think. Maybe firstly about how to categorize there is different CDR options in before I jump into the land-based and biomass options. I always think it's helpful to understand that, to do that from the perspective of what purpose are you categorizing different CDR option. You can do that from the perspective of assessing potentials and at a certain time frame, or from the perspective of the consideration of side effects, or from a policy perspective rather, considering various options, investments and rewards. So I don't have a particular preference, but I always think that a sole focus on the issue of permanence is maybe also difficult in terms of recognizing the potential in the land sector in particular. In any case, so on the land-based and biomass options, they have come more into focus internationally in the integrated assessment models, as have been already recognized, and also in the EU scenarios. And both have clearly pros and cons in terms of technological readiness, MRV, permanence, etc., etc. There is also what I always think is helpful, that there is a certain competition between them. I think that from the biomass perspective, it's clear that if you use more land for an option as BECCS, that it could have a potential negative effect on carbon sinks. So from a policy perspective, that's also important to carefully consider. So 3 broad issues I wanted to bring in is on environmental integrity, coherence with broader policy objectives, and then considerations on policy approaches. So in the land sector, I think it's important that a specific challenge is to monitor and verify that a ton of carbon dioxide removed is actually a ton of carbon dioxide removed, not only recognizing the full chain in terms of upstream and downstream emissions, but also to ensure that they are real, additional, measurable, and permanent, and that carbon leakage and double counting are avoided. And MRV in the land sector is generally associated with a high level of uncertainty. So that is a particular challenge in that regard. So that's the first issue, I think, that is really important to take into consideration for policy design and the use of different tools, including LCA approaches. And I think that in learning from the bioenergy policies where we don't include, for example, biogenic carbon as an element in an LCA approach, you can see that the broader policy context in that sense is also important to the incentive effect for certain biomass uses in terms of scale. So the point here is that the policy approach that you take is also important for priority incentive effect. Then the broader socioeconomic and environmental issues that the land ecosystem services range from socioeconomic services, provisional services, regulating services, biodiversity, and cultural services. And so if you take a look at land from a carbon perspective, you it's helpful to also consider co-benefit and negative externalities, considering all these other ecosystem services that land may provide, and that's not only that's potentially making that MRV question more complex, but it can also be helpful in terms of recognizing the value, and when you talk about credits, also increasing the value of certain credits, especially in the light of possible co-benefits in the land sector. Then maybe last I wanted to reflect on on policy approaches, not only in the light of the current ongoing work of the Commission, but also with a bit of a longer view, I guess. So yes, we need both abatement and removals to 2050 and beyond, and so an outlook on carbon neutrality brings in removals, but a trajectory towards that year is also important, and a progressive contribution of both in that regard. So it would be helpful in that sense, to have an ongoing clarity about the extent of non-abatable emissions, but also to have a discussion about how removals come in, and in the connection to what what extent of non-abatable emissions in different sectors, and the Commission has been clearly linking also the scope for removals to the idea of a circular bioeconomy. So in that sense, that's helpful in moving that discussion forward. But in terms of a policy design, that in my mind, it brings in several questions still to be discussed, perhaps with the participants here as well. One is the separation of targets and the design of specific pillars. Historically, there has been a strict firewall between ETS and LULUCF, and limited flexibility between the ESR and LULUCF. Because of the MRV issues and environmental integrity in first instance. So how can we look at that also towards 2030, but also beyond that, in the light of investment needs, but also in light of the environmental integrity that needs to be ensured. And then secondly, the reward to practitioners that is really needed on the land side and the removal side. What options are there in the light of the MRV challenges? And in relation to that, a point that I think is very relevant, what scope is there for broader regulatory mainstreaming in light of the agricultural policies, LULUCF, and restoration targets on the environmental side. So I'll leave it there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Linde, for increasing the complexity. But these are all very valid points, which will come back more and more in the discussion as we go on. There has been one comment on or question whether we circulate the slides. We are happy to do so, I guess. Sabine, you're okay, and so we'll do that. And later on, in any case, you can also listen to the webinar again. Let's turn to Fabien. You saw already, maybe, I don't know whether you were able to follow the chat. There were quite a few questions already directly or indirectly addressed to you, but no point now to look into this. What I'm interested, what kind of categorization really works best for the policy framework, technology versus nature? And immediately we got a chat debate on that one, which was quite expectable. There was a reference to process, then to storage type. Of course, permanence is a key point, or where it ends up was mentioned at some stage. So that I think, I don't know what would be working best for you, or what kind of area, what kind of sort of thoughts are you having on this? But any other point, of course, Fabien, you want to make, please, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thanks so much also for all the three first presentations that were actually addressing many of the points that we are thinking about and we are reflecting on in the context of these initiatives that we have started at the European Commission on thinking about a regulatory framework for the certification of carbon removal. So I'm not going to repeat all what has been said, but just very quickly and shortly, yes, our starting point is IPCC report, so this is science. Starting point is analysis we have conducted on the long-term strategy, and we see we need carbon removals. Why we need carbon removals? Because I see three pillars of the long-term climate action. Continuing to reduce emissions, so reduce reliance on carbon. We have to use less carbon. For the remaining part of the economy that needs carbon, because there will be still parts of the economy that need carbon, we need to have the different sources of carbon. And I like very much the discussion that Sabine started on CCU aspects. I think this is a very important discussion. I think we will need CCU because why? Because simply we should not use any more fossil fuel on the long term. We should try to have a loop that is between atmosphere, vegetation, and ourselves, but we should stop to get a fossil fuel out of the ground to put it in the atmosphere clearly. And we will need CCU solutions to have innovative technologies for that. And the third point is the topic of today on carbon removals. So you asked me what kind of categorization is the most useful from a policy point of view. This is an extremely difficult question, and this is something we are looking at. I will not be too much, how can I say, difficult with what exactly type of terminology we should use. We talk about nature-based solutions, natural solutions. I like to talk sometimes about ecosystem solutions. This is true that some people are talking about land-based solutions, industrial solutions, technology-based solutions. There is many terminology. What is important is when you talk about something, you are very transparent about what you are talking. On carbon removals and CCU, for instance, if you capture CO2 from the atmosphere and you are not storing it permanently, but you are reusing it for producing materials, construction materials, for instance, or Sabine was mentioning fuels, synthetic fuels, or even we can talk about advanced biofuels. This is also a kind of CCU. Except that instead of starting from the CO2, you start from the carbon from the biomass. And this is joining Linda's point on the importance of biomass. You have to be transparent and you have to say exactly what you are doing, and you should not call carbon removal something that is not storing permanently. But we need everything, and this is extremely important. And towards the end of the year, the Commission would like to try to present a bit better its vision on these different aspects of our carbon management, let's say. And we have the intention to come with a communication that will first we'll look at what working group one a group of the IPCC, because you know very well that the IPCC is going to produce an assessment report, the sixth one, over the summer. And maybe there will be new information on science. I think it has been mentioned in the chat. What is the carbon cycle response to carbon dioxide removal, for instance? When you know that when you emit 1 ton, well, 100 tons of carbon, let's say, only part of it is remaining in the atmosphere, about 50%, and part of it is very quickly absorbed by land and vegetation and the ocean. Sorry. In a case of a net negative scenario, what is happening after that you remove CO2 from the atmosphere? How much of the CO2 is going back from the atmosphere through vegetation and ocean? It's very important when you look at scenarios implying a net negative emission. So we want to see what science is saying, what the latest science is saying on that. To maybe do a little bit of update on the long-term strategy. We published long-term strategy 3 years ago. what has changed since, to take into account all the work done for the Fit for 55 and yeah, the new ambition of the European Union. And we will look at different solutions for carbon removals. And when we look at solutions, we need to look at the environmental integrity of the solutions. Of course, we need to look at how robust it can be to implement these solutions in terms of monitoring, reporting, and verification system. We need to look at baseline issues, additionality, to avoid double counting. There is so many aspects that are extremely important, and we should not also forget what has already been said also by Linda, the link with biodiversity, with water resources, and other environmental aspects that we should be careful. So this is something we would like to do for the end of the year. We will also look, of course, at the efficiency of the solution, the administrative burden, what could be the impact on market, and this kind of element. We have to keep that in mind when we look at different carbon removal solutions. We need also to look at the coherence with the other policies. If some solutions are certified, others are not certified, what will be the impact? We need to have an overall overview on that. And of course, the feasibility of implementing carbon removal through different type of solutions. So yes, towards the end of the year, we'd like to present a little bit more about that from the Commission. What is our view on this? What is our perspective? And to try to provide a kind of action plan to support this solution in the future. What type of action we need to take to support carbon removal and recycling carbon in the future, looking at aspect with when we capture CO2, but also at the biomass aspect, because there is not so many different forms of carbon. You can capture carbon directly from the atmosphere, or through photosynthesis, and you have biomass, and then after you do something out of the carbon from the biomass. You can do, I mentioned already advanced biofuels, but there is also wooden constructions that are very important, and can be a long-term storage of carbon. I will not say permanent, but long-term storage. So many interesting links to do between bioeconomy and the management of carbon. There was many questions in the chat. I didn't read all of them. Happy to take some specific one maybe, but now I will stop here to leave the floor to participants and attendees.
Thank you, Fabien, for this overview. And I'll almost let you go to answer some of the questions, but we may also get back to them. But can I get back on the certification? Of course, that's the backbone, and and everybody probably agrees this is important, should be simple, robust, all the rest of it, and it should be fast. How confident are you that you get this done really in a relatively short period, 2022, 2023, or whatever you have in mind?
Yeah. So as you say, it's a big challenge. I think we'll be able to hopefully to propose something by 2023, or let's see exactly when. What we should be careful at is when we develop this certification mechanism, we need to, as you said, we need to build something very robust, and we have to keep in mind that technologies, that carbon removal practices will evolve in the future. So I think we should start with something, with solutions and certifications that we know where the risks of, let's say, I don't know, leakages of CO2 or difficulties of monitoring, reporting, validation, verifications of preserving the environmental integrity are rather limited. So solutions, the most mature solutions that has proven to work, and to start with certification on working on these solutions. But still to have a framework that can evolve in the future, and to integrate new solutions when they will come ready. So this is an important part. By 2023, I don't think we will have the final version of the certification system. We will need to take lessons from the initial phase of the implementation, you know, for instance, with the ETS over the years. And I think the certification of carbon removal should also take this kind of trajectory, learning from the lessons or during the implementation of the system, the evolution of the technologies, the evolution and what well, different elements that will make the certification system more robust over time.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious of time. Time is running very, very fast. We have looked at, said we want to have a lot of discussion. Maybe if you allow me, we would like to go to our presentations on the 5-minute presentations on the negative emissions from Jelle Bijma and Hans-Jörg Lechemüller, and there may be one or the other else more. Now, maybe Jelle or Hans-Jörg, you want to kick off, and we have asked you to cover in 5 minutes. I know it's a fantastic challenge, and I'm sure also you will be up to it. The volumes and the monitoring certification, but also permanence and the demand side. But maybe since we are a little bit now with the certification, maybe you want to say a few words on that especially. Would anybody of you be able to speak up right now? Hans-Jörg or Jelle or someone else?
Yeah, happy to start. Well, thanks again for the invitation. So you want me to start? I had a short interruption while you obviously changed and included me into the presenter mode. So I didn't hear everything. So we have asked you to focus on 4 points. I mean, volume, monitoring, but the point was now, since we discussed a little bit the monitoring, how robust is your monitoring? Maybe you can focus a little bit more on this. Well, yeah, but I suggest we do the interaction of 5 minutes presentation.
Yes.
And I will focus. And happy to focus then.
No, sure. Otherwise, we need to know what you are referring to.
Exactly. Okay. So I'm gonna share my screen now and have 5 minutes, right?
Yes.
So you can see the screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, and here's the presentation. Perfect. Well, once again, thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Hans-Jörg Lechemüller. I'm a mixture of a scientist, an entrepreneur, and a climate activist, strongly involved in biochar, and fully convinced that biochar is a very attractive solution to capture carbon and to provide a very durable and stable source. So first of all, what is biochar? It's carbon is captured by nature. It could be trees, but it could be anything. It could be crop and the crop residues, and the residues from the growth will then, with technology, be converted into a very stable form of carbon, which is biochar. Then the biochar will have to be conditioned to its application, and will ultimately then be applied to soils or into construction. And the very special thing of biochar is that it's carbon capture, using and storing it, because it's converting the carbon into a very stable form. Biochar also goes hand in hand with bioenergy, because it's always the technical and the implementations of biochar are always in combination with energy production, so CO2 neutral heat or heat and energy production of biochar, and with that the negative emissions go along. Traditionally, the first applications were in agriculture. I don't touch that. There's a lot of literature on that, scientifically very clear that there's application benefit of the usage of biochar, and there is also benefits on the climate, for example, in compost with a reduction of climate gases. So there is, that's clear. So that's the agricultural application, but we see more and more applications of biochar which move into construction materials. So this is one example in asphalt. Another one, a very smart solution where biochar is used for a facade element. 85% of carbon content in this facade element, or lately published experiment on using biochar in concrete construction elements. Now, the biochar is not new, but it's growing very, very fast. So this is a market overview on biochar production capacity. We conducted early this year, and we see that the growth of the production capacity is immense. And the growth is even growing, as by the end of 2021, we will have another doubling as compared to 2020.
Who buys all that? Who buys this supply?
Today, most of the biochar goes into agriculture, respectively into city tree plantings, landscaping, where there is clear benefit of using the biochar, for example, for city trees. They just grow better, and that's animal feed and city trees are the biggest markets. Now, as to the question of volumes, we just didn't, a scenario analysis and said 15% of the 1990 emission equals to 850 million tons biochar, million tons CO2. And we as biochar industry are ready and willing to provide 30% of that amount, which equals to 255 million tons of CO2. And what we did here is an extrapolation of the historic growth rates, which, as I showed you, spearhead in a close to 100% growth. Extrapolating that with 80%, we will achieve the 255 million tons CO2 by the year 2035. If the growth is slower, it'll take a bit longer. Now to the 4 questions. The volume, which volumes are possible in negative emissions. These are the 255 millions, which we believe is achievable in Europe. So those numbers were all Europe, not full world, but only Europe. We believe that this is achievable by 2035, 2040, the latest. Global potential is in the range of gigatons. In terms of monitoring, and this is an important point, there is existing certification, the so-called EBC, European Biochar Certificate. They published a standard on quantification of the carbon removal quantity, including an LCA, and that was now implemented by a company called Carbon Future. That includes tracking till the end user, but there is no monitoring in a way required, as if you apply biochar in concrete, you don't need monitoring. It's just impossible to burn it anymore. Or if you apply biochar in soils, it is impossible to take it out, as and it won't degrade at a relevant volume. So when we talk about the permanence element in soil applications, permanence is centuries to millennia. In durable materials like concrete, we're talking millennia. And I forgot to say that there are also other standards are now standing up, are currently under preparation to provide other standards for the certification. But it's today everything in voluntary market. But very clearly, we talk about a permanent storage when we talk about biochar. On the demand side, what incentives do we believe are necessary to create the demand? We believe that we, and it was said before, we very much like the separation of reduction and carbon sinks. And we think we need regulatory and industry roadmaps with obligations to create durable and accountable carbon sinks. Then I think we need rules for smart usage of biomass. We love cascading. And we also like combination of biochar with CCS, because when you do biochar, there's always a remaining element of carbon that goes into the atmosphere, which then could be retrieved exactly the same way as planned with BECCS. Okay, that was my 5 minutes. I guess it was.
You were getting close to the 5 minutes. You know? Thank you. Okay, thanks for this. It's always nice to see a little bit the practical side. You know, things are happening rather than to discuss on the theoretical, and that you have ideas of how to take this further. I'm sure you're discussing this with the Commission. Could you take your slides off again? You know, I'm suggesting, you know, there is the other people coming in between. Can I just ask my colleague Milan to pick up some of the questions that have been arising, addressing them, maybe, you know, also shift them to some of the other panelists if you can, and then we go to Christoph, if this is okay, Christoph.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, so, you know, Milan, you want to pick some of the questions in, there were so many, we cannot do all of them unless we get into extra time.
No, indeed, some very good discussion, and also thanks very much for Sabine for already elaborately answering some of them. I would still like to get back to Sabine on some of them, because I think they were really interesting questions that deserve our attention. So the first one was from Lewis, whether there could be some elaboration on why the pricing of carbon dioxide removal and emissions reductions will be the same in principle, because they're not inherently different mechanisms. But since this really has policy implications, it would also be great to hear Fabienne's view on that. Second question was from Albertine, which is about the like-for-like characteristics of emission reductions and removal, because there has been a recent paper that raised a few issues on whether this really is the case if you consider the full carbon cycle. Again, this would have or could have some pretty significant policy implications. So also, Fabienne, if you could give a short reaction on that, that would be great. And then finally, a question from Jan, which I would like to address to Linde, is on carbon sinks, but particularly the use of things like direct air capture. If you then use the captured carbon to produce synfuels, is this actually a good thing from a policy perspective? Should this be pursued, or is it perhaps better, especially if you more look at road transport emissions as a whole, to only consider tailpipe emissions? So please, back to the panelists, and perhaps we can start with Sabine.
Yeah, maybe shortly on the question about different mechanisms and why I said that in principle, if everything worked perfectly, so to say, you would price CDR or a ton removed equally compared to a ton avoided. That's of course resting on the premise that things work okay, and that I mean, the mechanisms, yes, they are different, but from an incentive point of view, a ton that we subtract from our budget is a ton that we subtract, whether we remove it or whether we avoid it, is basically shouldn't matter in that sense. But having said that, there are a number of uncertainties around this that would call for price differentiation. For instance, if we are not sure that a ton removed is really equivalent to a ton avoided, and we had that discussion separately as well. There might be carbon cycle feedbacks. A ton, 1 ton removed might not be removed as permanently as another one. In that case, you would indeed need price differentiation. But in principle, if all these things could be included, if you could perfectly monitor it, if that ton was really permanently avoided, then nothing would argue against having a different price. In fact, it might actually be, from a theory point of view, be counterproductive, right? If you would then price a ton removed higher than a ton avoided, you might actually have unwanted outcomes from that. But I mentioned a number of issues why it might be warranted to maybe even have a higher support in the beginning, because you have this innovation gap, and you might want to have those technologies handy once you have to remove residual emissions because you're running out of time. So yes, the mechanisms are different, but from an incentive point of view, I was arguing in theory, and I acknowledge that there are a lot of arguments or points why you might want to differentiate prices, especially in the short term.
Thank you, Sabine. Fabien, you would like to take the second point before we go to Linda?
Yeah, maybe just to complement on the first one of Sabine, I fully agree that from a theoretical perspective, yes, if we want to be cost efficient, this should be the case, and a ton removed or a ton not emitted, if everything worked perfectly, should be addressed under the same, let's say, mechanism and having the same price. But the thing is that it's not working always perfectly, and we have to be sure that all the externalities are included and everything is included. And this is extremely difficult, and that's why there was also all this discussion during the climate law on ensuring that there is a minimum of pure reduction in the target for the European Union, the 55% target, and the rules, I think, is only coming to with a threshold in the accounting form. So yes, there is the theory, and I fully agree with Sabine. And then there is the implementation that sometimes is much more difficult. I think the second question was about the like-to-like on the equivalence of a ton of carbon removed from the atmosphere again and not emitted. But I think it was more related to, yes, as mentioned already, to the carbon cycle response and this question of when you look at the other way around about the airborne fraction of CO2 remaining in the atmosphere when you emit, and how much of the carbon removals you need to remove from the atmosphere when you're on the re-emission in ocean. Element, and I think there's still a mechanism on this as IPCC community, so all the scientists behind the IPCC that are specialized in climate science, many of them are looking at these aspects. And of course, when we'll have some evidence, we'll need to take them into account also in our policies.
Thank you. Linda, briefly, please. Sorry, we're having so many discussions, so many questions.
I'll keep it brief. I'm not. Yeah. So on DAX, I think, or let's say the potential for carbon capture and storage and long-term storage of the carbon. I think that the question about circularity. Yeah, the question is, is the carbon permanently stored, which is not necessarily ensured through circularity, I would say. So, in that sense, I think our experience with biomass is often the most useful example. We have a certain circularity of paper use, but it still leads to to loss of carbon emissions, obviously. So in that sense, it depends. I think on the biomass side and the land use side, as I think I said in my introduction, I think that it's important to really look at it from a broader perspective and ensure that you are strategic in where you have the biggest potential to enhance your sink in line with broader objectives. And in that sense, I think that it also links to cost-effective mitigation strategies, across sectors. So it depends, in this example that is provided in the chat. Okay, what is your potential of decarbonization of the building sector with bioenergy use? It's, for example, what is your potential to decarbonize the energy sector, industry, etc., without or with limited biomass use, and what kind of effect would that have on the sink side, or vice versa? So I think that in that sense, strategic thinking, needs to be, and is being done on the allocation of resources in an efficient, cost-efficient way, also in light of broader policy objectives, as was already mentioned by Fabian earlier. Thank you.
Thank you. More and more questions are coming in. They are being addressed by chat, etc. We will not be able to do everything. Also, Tobias Gress, I'm not sure whether we will have time. You ask a question. Let me just, before we go to Christoph, just make a suggestion to all of you, and we no need to decide upon this, but I just wonder whether we should have not a sort of a regular meetings exchange going, among stakeholders hosted by SAPS, that we discuss this issue, each of the sub-questions. We have probably identified 10 sub-questions today, and so that we go deeper. Having a jour fixe, could be a hybrid meeting, could be an online meeting, could be whatever we choose it. So that is sort of a bit my take from this very active discussion, and very deep and very informed. Now, Christoph, before you have to leave, let us, please come in. Christoph and Amy, please, give us your take on the volume and all the rest.
Yeah, thank you, Christian, and thanks for the opportunity. I'll be very brief and build on all the things that have been said before. So volume. So in theory, because direct air capture is very space efficient, it could achieve very high volumes. In the IPCC report, it's specified between 0.5 gigaton to 5 gigaton. Maybe I just want to mention the two important bottlenecks. The first one is obviously the renewable energy that is needed to scale this. And our take on this, that the laws of demand and supply apply. So we also see this in a way that if there's more direct air capture plants being built, then we will also enhance the demand for renewable energy, or at least try to. And the other bottleneck, and that's the main one, is clearly scaling. So to get to these volumes that are described in the IPCC, we need to build an industry, and to build an industry takes time. And so scaling, if we want to achieve gigaton scale or several gigatons in 2050, we have to start now. It takes about 10 years to go from this early stage technology it is, or this kind of early commercial stage technology to a big industry. That's the first point I would like to make. The second point I would like to say is, as Fabian said, there are only two ways to achieve negative emissions. One is via biomass, and one is via technological solutions like direct air capture and enhanced weathering. Now, biomass takes up a lot of space, and it's not infinitely scalable, and therefore, you know, we need the technological solutions as well, but they behave in very different ways. So, you know, biomass obviously cheaper, but many ways like afforestation are less permanent. I will talk about that in a second. And direct air capture at the moment is still early stage, so it's expensive, like Sabine mentioned, like solar, but it will come down in price if it is scaled. But we have to start this very early. So with a view to policy mechanisms and demand, obviously, in our view, things like reverse auctions are only in part helpful to bring all of these different solutions along, or at least if they're not designed to differentiate between the solutions. So we need to think about policy mechanisms that bring all of these solutions that we have and know we need along, so they can come down in terms of cost at large scale. And if we don't do that, there's a difference between cost and price, right? The markets will have to, I say, explode in order to get us to net zero. There will be demand for permanent removals, and then, you know, if the volumes are not there, the prices will have to go up. Maybe very briefly on the permanence. So Climeworks is using direct air capture with mineralization. The other way is direct air capture with sequestration. Both store for you know, centuries or millennia, and obviously mineralization is the most permanent form of storage. So once the CO2 turns into stone underground, it's the carb fix method. I won't go into it. It's really, you know, locked away forever. This also shows we have Climeworks has been you know, verified independently recently, and Climeworks Carbon Engineering and also the negative emissions platform, we have joined the CCS Plus initiative, you know, where we work on another standard, and also, you know, for CCS some parts, but also obviously we try to ensure the separation of CCS and CDR. With that, I hope I stayed in time, and we'll hand over to Amy for remarks on demand.
Yeah, Christoph, you did it short 1 minute. You know, we invite you again. Huh? Thank you.
Thanks.
Amy.
Great. Hopefully you can see my slide too now, and thank you to Christoph. So I'm Amy Ruddock. I'm VP of Europe for Carbon Engineering. My background is PhD in physics, and then many years in the aviation sector. So well placed to talk about demand. I'm just going to cover that fourth point on creating demand incentive after 2030. I think first I'll talk about demand, and then I'll come back to the date. Also trying to go pretty fast. So just for context, we're deploying the first megaton scale direct air capture plants in the US, which is what you can see on the screen here. We're leveraging the Californian low carbon fuel standards, which is trading at around $200, and the 45Q tax credits, which you can gain about $45 from. Oh, my screen is gone, but hopefully you can still hear me.
Yeah,
there we go. So we can create that revenue stack in the US, but unfortunately across Europe, that revenue stack doesn't exist yet, and plants have a bit of a chicken and egg issue. So on the demand side from private investors and infrastructure funding, we're seeing a lot of interest in investing in direct air capture. But the problem is when these infrastructure investors look at the technology, the feedback to us is the technology risk is fairly low, but they don't have the revenue certainty that they require. So the market risk is particularly high. To address that somewhat, both we and Climeworks have started engaging the voluntary market with products, and we're seeing growing demand as more and more commit to net zero and start to understand what permanent removals mean. But voluntary commitments aren't going to be enough to get to gigatons, and corporate entities don't provide that really strong counterparty for the risk of a 30-year offtake from a plant. So we do need to create a liquid market, which has a direct or an implied carbon price that is greater than the cost of direct air capture. And I know, as Christoph said, the costs differ between different technologies, different carbon dioxide removal methods. So we need to recognise that if we're going to encourage a portfolio. A carve out within the ETS may be an option, creating an obligation to permanently remove or take back carbon. I would say, though, that direct air capture and CDR can decarbonise hard to abate sectors like transportation, and the cost of transportation they're seeing from in-sector pathways today often well exceeds direct air capture solutions. So another option is to think about direct air capture as a pathway within transportation policies, which is what we've done with the LCFS over in California. Finally, I guess before that liquid market's created, I think there's a role for government to support first-of-a-kind plants through initial deployment, looking at ways like carving out of the innovation funds sufficient to build those hundreds of megatons. I said I'd mention the date. I think it's not about creating incentives after 2030, it's doing it now. We're ready to deploy at scale now, and waiting for longer means that we're losing that time to get on the S-curve of technology. We're losing the time to think about the commercial and policy basis of removals. So hopefully I've stuck within the time. That's what I had to add. Thank you.
So thank you. Yeah, even shorter, very clear. Now I'm looking at time. I don't know whether Jelle has prepared something or whether we should postpone it to some other time.
In fact, I didn't prepare anything because I thought this is just for me to chip in some ideas. But I can say a few words about enhanced weathering. It is permanent. It is something that where the infrastructure is there. I'm talking now about combining it with agriculture, and so the farmers would do it if the incentives are there. If they get their money, they can basically replace the artificial fertilizer with rock flour or rock powder. You can combine it with biochar, thereby improving the quality of your soil. Biochar also helps to balance the delivery of the nutrients to the plants. It helps by basically storing some of the water. How much this can be, this is taking up, how much CO2 is sequestered is still a question. There are models. There are only a few field trials that have been done, but the data are not around yet. So we are now working on something in the field, and maybe I can share my screen. Let's see if that works.
Yeah,
I think that is the one.
but
Do you see my screen?
no, we don't. Yeah, now it's coming. Yeah.
You're seeing something? Because I don't see it myself. Do you see a screen?
Yeah, but we see it. Yeah.
Okay. So just to say something about what's happening, basically what you're doing, I hope you see my cursor also.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what you do is you're dissolving, in fact, you're dissolving the rock. It was categorized under technological, not on the nature-based. Now, to me, this is very, very nature-based because this is exactly how Mother Earth does it, just on longer timescales. We came from a hothouse world in the Miocene when the ice caps were built up, and that was all weathering. We need to speed it up, and we're basically balancing the uptake of CO2 in the form of bicarbonate by cations. Now, this is these are the reactions, for instance, for olivine or turpentine. This is an example of a field where we are now trying the different treatments
We hear you badly. Can you go closer to the microphone? Yeah.
I can, yes. Sorry. Let me see this. You see this this picture of the field now. We have a couple of different treatments. We are trying to work with olivine and basalt, also with biochar, mix it with biochar, and the primary goals are really to quantify the weathering. We don't know its potential yet. Like I said, just from the modeling. We want to assess heavy metal risks, and in fact develop an easy to handle sensor-based inorganic carbon monitoring device, because you cannot ask the farmers to employ a chemist to measure his fields. So this is done using sensors, and we hope to have the first results by the beginning of next year. Like I said, it may also have important advantages for the concentration of soil organic carbon. So the cation exchange capacity may increase, and therefore you can probably increase the capacity of soil carbon. Now, soil carbon by itself is not very permanent, but the enhanced weathering definitely is. How we can scale it up, to be honest, I don't know.
You would need to come to the end, Jelle.
Yes, well, I can stop here. If
Okay.
there are questions, I gladly answer.
Yeah, no, thank you for this. If you could take your screen away.
Yes.
Then we see each other again. Okay. No, we still see your stop share screening. If
yes.
Stop share screen, then yes, thank you. Okay, now I'm cautious of time. We're already running over time. Now, I suggest at that stage we bring this to a close. I'm sorry for those questions. You know, there were so many good questions we couldn't address. But that will have to be for next time. I don't know whether the speakers, the panelists, want to have a last word, or whether it's okay if I bring this to a close. Is there anything urgent from Linde, Fabien, Sabine you want to add? That seems not to be the case. I see smiling faces. So Fabien, you raised your hand, or?
Yeah, no, just maybe one point, because it has been bring in several times, and I think it's important. It's when the Commission is developing the certification of carbon removal, one of the key elements of this and the main aspect and objective is to incentivize directly the farmers, the foresters, the people that are providing carbon farming solutions, the innovative industries, so to bring an instrument in the portfolio of policy options that we have at the European level, to have some things that is targeting more directly the people that are implementing directly the solutions. And I just wanted to say that I fully agree that we need this in the European context.
Okay, thank you. So let me then bring this to a close, a bit in extra time, but you know, that happens if you have interesting discussions. We will share the practical parts first. We will share the slides with you. We will also, you know, make a few bullets, a summary, and also how we take the work further from here. And we hope you will be engaging further with us. Now, what I take from it, we had deliberately a very broad discussion, and we were aware of this, but now you realize it gets even further broader. And if we invite another set of 4 speakers, probably we get even further and deeper. So I would very much think we should continue this discussion, and maybe make a clearer distinction between all the analytical points, the things which still need analysis, but also the policy framework discussions and bringing always the practical points in there. I had suggested before, and there was some feedback in the chat, to have a kind of jour fixe, regular discussions on some of these points, very much focused, perhaps one on nature-based and some of the issues there, certification, the demand side, you know, all the 4 bullets and many more. So we think about whether there's an interest, but the key of such a jour fixe would be that the group is relatively small, and that so we can really go a little bit deeper. Let us just wait until we come with a suggestion. We will pick up many of the points, no, all of them, you have mentioned here in the background paper. In the paper, we will work them in and try to structure the work further. That is all from me. I don't know, Milan, whether you would like to add on a few points and do the closing.
No, I think it was a fantastic debate, both in the actual meeting as well as in the chat. So we try to stick as close as possible to things that are really unequivocally established by the IPCC. But then it's also really great to see not one but multiple IPCC people discussing these issues in the chat, and it really adds a lot to the discussion, and it really helps clarify some of the fundamentals. On the policy part, there will be a lot to discuss in the future still, especially with a number of reforms, both on effort sharing and the ETS, and also things affecting carbon capture and storage coming up. And we at least hope to clarify what the relevant questions will be in our paper. So thank you very much to everyone who participated, in particular the speakers, and see you next time.
So thank you. And the end of the meeting. And I see you again. Thank you.